How y'all doing? Y'all all right? It's good to be here. I am delighted to be here as opposed to the 25th anniversary of the National Action Network. I'm actually really, I prefer to be here than there. It's good to see old friends. Thank you, Dean Sterling, for that amazing introduction. I called my mother or my mama before I came. I said, Ma, I know we country folk from Mississippi, but your baby's at Yale. And she said, Yale? I said, yes, Yale, Ma. And she said, well, okay, do your best. I said, all right, I will. So I've been traveling around the country. And in some ways, I've been trying to provoke a conversation about where we are with regards to matters of race, trying to offer an account of how we got to this moment, and to think out loud with others about how we might address it. And so what I want to do tonight is to talk a little bit about that. And then hopefully provoke you so that we can have the kind of conversation I think we ought to be having in the nation more broadly. So let me just jump into it. Is that okay? So I've written a book for a popular audience. And this has required a shift in my writing and an insistence, at least on the part of my editor, to suppress my scholarly tendencies. We had a tremendous battle over footnotes. When I wrote the first version of the book, he came to my office in Princeton from New York and said he didn't like it, that I had to do something else. So I literally had to write another book. Right? As such, the philosophical scaffolding of the book is in the background. And I suppose that is a good thing. After all, I do want folks to buy and read the book. But what I propose to do this afternoon is to give a brief account of the philosophical backdrop of Democracy in Black, to make explicit my commitments and how they drive the conclusions of the book. And what should become clear is that the book, at least to my mind, although written for a broad audience, is in fact an extension of my previous work on pragmatism and Black politics. Now, I suppose I should say something about the motivation. I think of myself as a public intellectual of sorts, and I'm aware that the phrase obscures more than it reveals. And today, public intellectuals function more like pundits. Right? We're on television and radio tossing around opinions about everything, and I'm implicated in it all. Right? I find myself on shows like Morning Joe, trying desperately to say something that's nuanced and thoughtful as I sit among people with whom I have very, very deep disagreements. And oftentimes, all too often, the medium gets in the way. Right? So I'm well aware of the perils of public intellectual work, but I wanted to write a book that reached beyond a narrow set of considerations in the academy. I wanted to enact what John Dewey commends in his essay on the influence of Darwin on philosophy, that philosophy is best as a form of social criticism, that we are at our best when we bring our skill sets to bear on the problems of society. So in my hands, this formulation takes on the form of thinking carefully in public with others. Thinking carefully in public with others. That's my definition of public intellectual work. But there's another motivation as well. I wanted to write a book my mama could read. And she's currently on chapter 7. So Democracy in Black is divided into two distinct but related parts. And I'm going to be focusing on the first part this afternoon. I'll say a little bit about the second part. The first half of the book offers an account of the persistence of racial inequality, and the second half examines the complex ways Black politics and Black political actors contribute to our failure to address substantively that inequality. Okay? Underlying both is an unstated concern about the arrest of our moral, and by extension, our political imaginations. The arrest of our moral, and by extension, our political imaginations. I'm fond of telling my students that Emerson tells us that God speaks to us through our imaginations. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Wonderful formulation, that God speaks to us through our imaginations. And I often ask my students when I invoke this, right, if that's true, then what is the devil doing? In so many ways, at least I suggest this implicitly in the book, that we are experiencing a crisis of imagination, an arresting of the imagination. And I mean by this something more than a failure to be creative, rather that something about who we are as Americans has actually gone out of focus. Some sort of major moral failing currently defines our way of being in the world. Now, to my mind, imagination registers much more than creativity or the ability to trade in that which isn't real, the fantastical. And here I'm thinking about that moment in Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. Quote, "A man, said, to be greatly good, must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination." The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. Here, imagination involves at least two senses. One is the ability to see the as yet, a willingness, as the religious historian Charles Long notes, to see beyond the opacity of one's condition, to envision the possible, right? Long had in mind black slaves and what he calls, appropriating Hegel's language, right, the lithic imagination, right? Right, quote, "The hardness of life or of reality was the experience of the meaning of the oppressed's own identity as opaque. Reality itself was opaque and seemed opposed to them, such that affirmations of black is beautiful, such that God is red." Right, these were these moments of reaching beyond the opacity of one's condition, right? Bob Moses told me the story once of organizing sharecroppers in Ruralville, Mississippi. And they were getting on a bus, and folk were nervous because they knew where they were driving. They knew what they were driving into. And folks were scared because they knew that they could be arrested. They knew they were going to be brutalized. And this person just kept singing at every moment. And Bob said to me, she was singing every spiritual that she knew. And then they realized what she was doing. She was trying to fortify their spirits, to give them the courage, right, to face what they were about to face. And this person wasn't the person that we actually know today at that moment. She was just a sharecropper. It was Fannie Lou Hamer. Now, what was it about her experience as a sharecropper which would lead her to believe that her actions could lead to something otherwise? Nothing in her experience would give her, right, the resources to imagine the world other than what the world had been. But there's something about the imagination that fortifies the spirits, right? The spirit. I've written about this elsewhere. In fact, I talked about this in, I think, this very room, to think about the imagination as the site of the prophetic, right? That it is the imagination in the exercise of critical intelligence, right? Which envisions the possible as a basis to critique and dismantle the current limits of one's circumstance. The imagination, bound up with what John Dewey describes as dramatic rehearsal. This is central to the exercise of intelligence, as he's kind of appropriating what we do in the context of the lab and experimentation, imagining what might be possible and then testing it in experience, running, or what William James might say as running ahead of the evidence, right, in which we can bring the fact into existence. I like to tell the story of my brother, my older brother, who he didn't want me to follow him to play baseball. And so they would jump a ditch, and then he would look back at me and go. And one day I just decided I was going to bring the fact of me being able to jump the ditch into existence. And so I just jumped it and then ran, and they put me in left field, right? Didn't catch one ball, right? But imagination involves that ability to see the as yet, to think about the possible as a basis to critique, right, current arrangements. But imagination also involves empathetic projection, that second emphasis. Remember Shelley's definition, right, that the person must put herself in the place of another and of many others. So it's not just simply the ability to see the as yet, it's also about empathetic projection, what John Dewey calls or describes as that animating moral judgment. That is, feeling our way beyond the narrow consideration of ours alone to take up the concerns and aspirations of others. Right? In his ethics, he talks about this as empathy, right? Or sympathy. In some ways. So the imagination isn't just about the world as it is and as it could be. It is also about who we take ourselves to be and how that emerges in our relations with others, particularly those who are not seen as one of us. So these two dimensions of the imagination. Today we find ourselves in these dark times, unable to imagine otherwise, it seems to me. The world as it is seems to be our permanent docking station. Not only does it block our ability to see the possible, it impairs our ability to empathize with those who are not us. And I hope you can see how I'm trying to characterize reactions to Bernie Sanders' campaign and the venom that we see at some of the Trump rallies, right? We can't imagine, right, free education. We can't imagine single payer. And we want to build a wall, right? Ugliness, right? Emblematic of who we are. Now, I want to say that the crisis of imagination says something about our characters, right? Remember, imagination is bound up with the idea of empathy and sympathy, right? What Shelley noted as putting oneself in the place of another and of many others. And in some ways, this is all about characters, and this is really important to the book, and I'll make that clear hopefully later. And here I'm thinking about character following Dewey, who's following Aristotle, as the interpenetration of habits, right? Character as the interpenetration of habits. Character makes us a certain kind of person, right? With an historically developed pattern of behavior. This point is really, I think, important to the very way in which I try to shift the ground from a Merdalian frame to much more of a kind of democratic virtue frame. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we live in a time where the superordinate value, it seems to me, is putting oneself over and against another. The superordinate value is putting oneself over and against another. And I think this is particularly the case when it comes to race matters. I want to read a section from the book, if you don't mind. Christine Fraser cried softly. She had been through hell and back, and the wounds had not healed. Chris had worked hard all her life. She and her late husband had dreamed big dreams for themselves and their family. They had played by the rules. But when Chris lost her home to foreclosure in 2012, everything changed. Now, at the age of 65, she was out of work and forced to live in a senior facility, her cherished home gone, her health deteriorating, and her dreams shattered. Quote, "Me and my husband had a business for 25 years, she said, in disbelief. I raised my daughter in that home. I wasn't a new homeowner. I had been there for 18 years. End quote. Before the eviction, Chris had lived with her 85-year-old mother, her adult daughter, her 4-year-old grandson in a triplex home in a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. The upstairs had 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and 2 big living rooms. There were 2 separate apartments downstairs. The house sat on a large plot of land with lots of open space where Chris's dog Sheba could run around. A minister who was a little person had designed the house. Quote, he had been an architect, I guess, and there was not a square room in that house the way he designed it. That's why I fell in love with it, end quote. Within a year of moving into their home, her husband lost his legs because of diabetes and had to use a wheelchair. Quote, but here's the kicker, Chris said. Since the house had been built for a dwarf, once the ramp was built, he could maneuver in that house just like anybody else because the switches were lower. It was like God sent us there, end quote. But when Chris lost her job in 2009, she struggled to make the payments. The house was underwater. She had already paid $240,000 on a home now valued at $40,000. Her mortgage changed hands at least 3 times in 6 months. Chris tried everything to prevent foreclosure, but the latest holder of her loan, Investors One Corporation, decided to evict her. President Obama had created a plan to help distressed borrowers, but Chris couldn't take advantage of it. The program required that homeowners be current on their mortgage, and she was not. But if you're current on your mortgage, Chris said, you don't need modification. The game seemed rigged to protect the mortgage lenders. Now, DeKalb County sheriffs and deputies arrived in the middle of the night on May 2nd, 2012, to evict her. Quote, they came in like I was a dope dealer. At 3 a.m, they drilled a hole in the lock in my front door. They drilled out the lock and just came in my house. It was the most terrifying moment that I can remember in my life. My grandson is 6 years old, and to this day, he does not like police officers because he remembers. He remembers, end quote. She's crying as she's telling me this. When the police stormed into the house, they ordered Chris and her family to get dressed immediately. Then they proceeded to empty the home of a life's worth of memories. It was chaos. For 7 hours, the police piled Chris's things onto the street. No one could help. The police had cordoned off the area. Quote, they told me to pack up as if I had just had a fire at my home and take my immediate possessions. And I had to leave immediately, she remembered. Everything was scattered without any care across the lawn. With no place to go, the family slept in the car, except for the family dog. The police made provisions for Sheba. Quote, that was the part that I think came out in the eviction. When they came for me at 3 a.m, they didn't have a place for me and my family to go. But the animal shelter came because they knew there were dogs there. They came with a place for my dog. So in the context of the Great Recession of 2008, over 240,000 homes in Black America was lost. So one of the motivations of the book is that I was trying to figure out, right, besides the fact I want to be a public intellectual, I want my mama to read a book and all that other stuff, one of the motivations was trying to figure out how could everybody talk about recovery when I was looking at the statistical data suggesting that Black America was in crisis. Right? How could people be talking about that we've turned a corner economically, right, when I was just looking around at my family, my friends' families, and seeing that many were losing their homes, many had re-entered the job market if they were lucky, right, not making nearly as much, having to choose between paying the rent and putting food on the table because many of them had lost their homes and entered into a brutal rental market, right? So 240,000 homes lost, right? Now we saw between 2008 and now that white wealth is 13 times that of Black wealth. And here we are finding ourselves right now in this moment where African-American unemployment is 10.1%, right, unadjusted. Right? At the height of the recession in 2008, when people were screaming that we were in crisis, the national unemployment rate was 9.8%. On top of that reality, right, of losing homes, I don't think we've seen this kind of loss of wealth in Black America since the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank in the 19th century. Right? On top of the fact that we see folks, right, struggling to re-enter the labor market, 38% of Black children are now in poverty, live in poverty. In my home state of Mississippi, 50% of African-American children are growing up in poverty. For the first time in the history of us taking the data, there are more poor African-American children than there are poor white children. And there are 3 times as many white children in America as there are Black children. And then you combine that with the fact, what? That folks have been grieving in public as if, right, the police have lost their damn minds. And mothers and fathers and uncles and aunts, right, and friends have had to bury their babies, have had to bury their loved ones in this kind of public act, this public ritual of grieving, grieving that has gone viral, right, that is shaping, right, the souls of another generation. But people are talking about recovery. How could they talk about recovery? Maybe these people are disposable. Maybe they're invisible. Well, they must be. Right? They must be. But something else must be going on here, right? And so I wanted to think about that much more carefully, right? So I'm talking about the imagination as the ability to see beyond our current moment, as the ability to empathize, right? To find oneself in another, right? Right? And so part of what I'm trying to think about, right, is that there's something fundamental. We talk about the achievement gap. We talk about the empathy gap. There must be something at the heart, at the bottom of all of this, and what I call the value gap. See, in the book, I maintain that democracies require particular kinds of dispositions to work admirably. But something has distorted and disfigured our national and individual character. Remember, I said this is about character, the interpenetration of habit, right? The kinds of human beings we are, right? Something has distorted who we take ourselves to be. And I want to call this the value gap. And what is the value gap? The value gap is the belief that white people are valued more than others in this country. This belief isn't the possession of loud racists, people running around with white sheets over their heads or swastikas tattooed on parts of their bodies. Rather, this belief animates our social practices, our political arrangements, and our economic realities. The value gap. We think about it at that moment in which the U.S. is giving voice to a notion of freedom. What John Adams says to King George, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment he's giving voice to an idea of freedom is predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom, right? You think about the moment of Civil War, right? A war fought over the issue of slavery, no matter what the Dunning School might say and others in terms of their understanding of the Civil War, right? But fought over the issue of slavery. And then we get radical Reconstruction, where we fundamentally try a multiracial democracy. And what do we get in response? We get the value gap in response. What do I mean? Convict leasing. It's not undone until the 1940s. You can't think about a city like Birmingham unless you think about the black labor that built it. Right? We get Jim and Jane Crow laws. Right? We get the export, right, of Jim Crow to the Philippines, to Haiti, to Cuba, right? We see the value gap assert itself, limiting, right, the very ways in which we imagine a kind of genuine multiracial democracy. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and we have, a massive movement for freedom and dignity on the part of black folk. And what do we get in response? We get a reassertion of the value gap. We get a call for law and order. We get the tax revolt in Northern California, a reassertion of the value gap. Even when we elect our first black president and people are suggesting that we turn a post-racial corner, what do we get? We get the vitriol of the Tea Party and an attack on the voting rights side. A reassertion of the value gap. And in each instance, there's progress. In each instance, there's progress, but progress is arrested by a reassertion of that value gap. And this is what I think people mean when they say things haven't changed, right? It's not that 2016 is the same as 1960, which is the same as 1860, but what is the same is that white people are valued more than others under different material conditions. But see, we have to think about this in a much more complicated way. It's not just simply about loud races. I always tell the story of the fact that my father, who was a very complicated man, was the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. That's high cotton back in the day, right? And Pascagoula is the place where former Senator Trent Lott's from. It's the place where William Faulkner honeymooned, and his wife tried to commit suicide in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a morbid story, but I like to tell it anyway. So he gets the job at the post office, so he decides to move his family with the precocious kids to the other side of town. And to give you a sense of my father, he's a Vietnam veteran, right? And as we were moving, one time when we weren't in the house for too long, and the kids in the back shot out our back door window with a pellet gun. And my dad responded with a 12-gauge shotgun and blew the limb of their magnolia tree off and said, "Shoot back here again." And as we were moving in the house a few weeks earlier, the police drove by really slowly, and my dad took out his keys and says, "Yeah, I own it. It's mine." But I'm playing outside with my Tonka truck. Those old Tonka trucks. You remember those Tonka trucks? My old Tonka dump truck, and I'm making my truck noises. And all of a sudden, I heard, "Stop playing with that nigga." And it's the first time that I had been called that. And I run inside, and I grab my truck, and I run inside, and I tell my father, this man who would respond in the way that he did. And I could literally see the past kind of consume him. And he ran outside. I don't know what he did, but 3 months later, there was a for sale sign in those folks' houses. At that folks, you know. But that's the way in which we tell the story of American racism, right? A family achieves the American dream. They get a big house on the hill. Some child gets wounded by some mean-spirited adult who calls them the N-word, and then she has to spend the rest of her life proving that she's not a nigger. But that's too easy. because I had already learned the value gap before we moved. Because in my old neighborhood, when it rained, my neighborhood used to flood because the pipes were bad. The sidewalks weren't paved. The baseball diamond, the ditch that I wanted to jump over to play baseball, it was rarely cut. The houses were smaller. The neighborhood was choked by the cycles of layoffs by the paper mill, the Porgy plant, the Ingalls shipyard. Everything in my environment in the old side, on the east side of town, told me that I was somehow less than, that I was somehow valued, and that my mother and father had to spend day in and day out proving what James Baldwin says in The Uses of the Blues, trying to keep something from taking root in my soul, that is, from keeping me from believing what white folks said about me. The value gap. It's not about people who are the loud racists. That's too easy. It lets us off the hook. Right? Focusing on the value gap, I think also at the level of abstraction, helps displace American exceptionalism. The idea that America is the Redeemer nation or the city on the hill, or as Reagan would say, the shining city on the hill. This idea, or what the late Sack Van Berkovich called the American ideology, secures the inherent goodness of the country, so much so that our practices can never call into question the ideals that purportedly animate our social world. It allows us to be racist and committed to democracy at the same time. And here I'm thinking about Gunnar Myrdal's classic 1944 book, The American Dilemma. And this book has provided the dominant frame for how we think about race relations in this country since its publication, that the problem is our practices. The problem is that our practices don't align with our creed. So all we need to do is live up to our creed. I reject the Myrdalian frame, right? That is, the problem is the gap between our practices and our creed, that what we need to do is engage in a kind of imminent criticisms of sort, measuring our current practices over and against our stated ideals, right? And that becomes the basis of criticism. Because I think at its root, this rigs the terms of the critique. Right? American exceptionalism rigs the terms of the critique, when the point of departure is the gap between the ideals and the practices usually, typically, born on the backs of the South, that barbaric region, right? If only the Southerners would get themselves right. And I keep telling my students, Flint is not in the South, right? We're always on the road to a more perfect union, right? We're always on the road to a more perfect union. We once owned slaves, we don't anymore, see? Women didn't vote, now they do, see? It's always evidence of our inherent goodness, but I want to take a different tact. Right? Remember, democracies require certain kinds of people to work. Right? I want to celebrate the cognitive virtues of free inquiry and openness to others and the diversity of opinion and communication, all of which evidences a genuine concern for something like the public good. That is, a willingness to take up concerns beyond narrow self-interest. Right? We could render this as a kind of democratic virtues, right? What the value gap does, in my view, is distort and disfigure the personality of those shaped and formed by it. In other words, the value gap blocks the way to the development of the kinds of persons democracies require. Here we aren't talking about American exceptionalism, a failure to live up to our ideas. No need to invoke some idea of the shining city on the hill or the Redeemer nation. No, instead we take up what it means to claim democracy as our own and what that demands of us. The emphasis on character, the kinds of people we are, leads me to talk about habit formation in the book. So there's a chapter on racial habits, right? And how those habits sustain the value gap, right? My use of habit following John Dewey as that which, I use habits following John Dewey as that which encompasses private behavior patterns and the stuff we inherit that help us move about the world. Social systems, stories, beliefs, myths, virtues, excellences, as well as vices, failings, right? Racial habits ought to be seen as a particular kind of social habit that sets the stage for individual habituation, right? As Dewey writes in A Common Faith, quote, "The community in which we, together with those not born, are enmeshed, is the matrix within which our ideal aspirations are born and bred, the source of the values that the moral imagination projects as directive criteria and as shaping purposes." End quote. So we come to virtuous behavior then, not by some heroic act of the will, but in the context of social arrangements that habituate and convict us to act in accordance to what is considered virtuous. who we are then is deeply bound up with the place we initially find our footing. To my mind, racial habits sustain the value gap. We know whenever we hear the phrase, I just want my kids to go to a good school, social scientists have unpacked what they mean. That essentially means how many black and brown people go to the school. When we talk about we want to live in safe neighborhoods, we know what that means. We know when we talk about American racism as just simply being called the N-word or just simply about police brutality, right? We lose sight of the way in which it works. I mean, a colleague of mine down at Rutgers, who's a social scientist, talks about social networking, right? Nancy DeTomaso, right? And what she did is she went and interviewed all of these folk from New Jersey and Tennessee, right? And what she was doing was really fascinating, right? She would interview these white folk, and they would say, I'm sorry to say, but these black people are just lazy. They just want folk to hand stuff out. They're dependent, they just want government to hand them something. And it turns out that his dad was really close with the union boss who got him his job. Another interviewer would say, I'm sorry to say, but black people are lazy, right? They don't want to work. They just want to be on welfare, right, and have babies. And it turned out not only did his friend give him the test, he gave him the answer to the test that got him the job. And these aren't folks who are explicitly racist. They just hang out in their social networks. And it just so happens that our social networks are 75% white. Think about your friends. And think about how opportunity passes along your social networks, right? Think about how many opportunities come before you as opposed to you, right? And so we think about racism, right? We think about the problem of the value gap as being the loud racists, the folk who are showing up at the Trump rallies, who are doing all of this ugly stuff, when in fact it's all of us, right? All of us. I tell my students all the time, white supremacy doesn't require white folk to work. That'll preach. Racial habits sustain the value gap, in my view. They block the way to the kinds of dispositions, I think, needed for democratic life, right? They block the way. So people, because of their habituation, right, and because of the value gap, right, will choose to act in ways, right, that undermine democratic commitments, right? And this is not about, right, living up to ideals, right? This is not about the idea of America as the Redeemer nation. This is about what we're doing in our day-to-day lives, the choices we're making that make us who we are. And then, of course, this is then rooted, I'm going to bring it to a close in a minute. This is rooted in deep-seated fears. Deep-seated fears. So right after the chapter on racial habits, I turn to white fear. Right? Those things that deepen the value gap. Remember, it's a crisis of imagination. Imagination, right, that we're arrested. We can't see beyond the now. We feel like we're stuck, right? We can't see the possible. And then we can't see others. Well, how does this happen? Right? I want to say we're habituated in such a way, right, to be committed to the value gap. And the value gap also is sustained and stoked by our fears, white fears. You can trace it all the way back to Jefferson's notes. Think about it. In the chapter in which that famous phrase from Jefferson, now I'm teaching, right? You see me walking all out here, right? That wonderful moment in Jefferson's notes where he says what? Right? I fear for the nation, right? Because of slavery. Remember that line? It's actually in the section on habit formation. Because he's writing about the ways in which the children of slave masters are socialized in the face of the violence exacted on the bodies of slaves. Right? So he's talking about how they themselves are habituated into a certain kind of moral economy, right, in that moment. But Jefferson at that moment is worrying. He's fearful about what slavery will mean, right, divine retribution. Even Lincoln at the second inaugural, right, thinks about the bloodshed of the Civil War in terms of divine retribution, right? And then, of course, the worry about black revenge. What will these people do? Haiti scared the shit out of people. I have to say it that way, right? Right? So black revenge, right? Black revenge, always, somehow these people got to be angry. They can't be waiting for them to be angry, right? They got to be angry. They got to be. We need some evidence that they're going to exact revenge, right? Or fear they're biologically criminogenic, right? They're inclined to destabilize the moral economy of the nation, right? So they're by definition either Willie Horton or Bigger Thomas. Two sides of the same coin, right? From the right and the left. They're either by nature that, or their environments have made them that, right? And guess what? This is something really important. I've left the text. White fear is so pervasive, it can generate these moral panics that can drive public policy. Super predator is just one example, right? John DeLilio, who was a colleague of ours at Princeton, remember him, Jennifer, right? He was at the source. So you remember he was at the source of this language of the super predator, that we were producing criminals who had could not in any shape, form, or fashion be held responsible by the society, by our social norms and moral norms, right? They were unlike anything we could have ever imagined, and more of them were coming, right? John DeLilio in 2001 said, if I had to do it all over again, right, I would push more for prevention, because the data proved he was absolutely making things up. But the idea of the super predator, right, pushed public policy. Think about the knockout campaign that was just a couple of years ago, right? One video goes viral of these young black men randomly knocking people out. The New York State legislature immediately passed laws, right? Driving policy, right? Moral panics, rooted in assumptions about who these black people are, right? Rooted in the value gap, habituating us in particular sorts of ways, right? But what's so fascinating about the value gap, what's so fascinating about the habits, and what's so fascinating about white fear in particular, is that it affects black political behavior. This is the transition to the second part of the book. I'm so afraid of triggering your fear that I have to don the mask. I have to dance the racial jig. Because it's your fear, right, that actually, right, threatens my well-being, right? So that off-color joke that we have to just sit there and take. Right? The fact that, we're moving through our social environments, in our schools, in our workplaces, and we have to endure the fact that somehow this doesn't feel right. But, as Kenji would say, we have to smile. We have to bear it. The fear of white fear limits and constrains how black people behave politically. Obama has to send racial dog whistles that aren't about code language about busing and all they like. He has to send racial dog whistles in order to allay the concerns of white voters that he's not a Manchurian candidate for black revenge. Right? So he has to have his sister soldier moments over and over again. He did so at the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. Suddenly he has to re-narrate African American history, such that black power becomes a moment of lawlessness only, right? Where people are seeking handouts as remember he says, we lost our way, as he re-narrates the black freedom struggle. In Selma, Alabama, the black freedom struggle becomes simply an example of American exceptionalism in Barack Obama's hands. But our fear of white fear keeps us from telling the truth. So white people, according to sociological data, don't want to be viewed as racist, right? And black folk don't want to trigger white folks' racism. And so guess what we do? We dance the dance. But I'm thinking about Malcolm. And he said, stop sweet talking them. Tell them what kind of hell you've been catching. And let them know if they're not ready to clean up their house, they shouldn't have a house. They should catch on fire and burn down. I ain't trying to burn down people's houses. Don't get scared. Don't get scared. But what he's insisting on is a kind of frank speech, a kind of honesty, that will break open the possibility for the kinds of conversations we need to have and the kind of work we need to do to uproot the habits that sustain the value gap. All of this will require a different kind of politics, The second half of the book takes that up. I found myself in North Carolina with the Forward Together movement with Reverend Barber, as he was organizing among, white folk in the Blue Mountains of North Carolina, LGBTQ, undocumented workers, right, teachers, right, prison reform, right, an extraordinary coalition of folks. So I witnessed the largest mass mobilization of progressive voices, right, a rainbow coalition in the truest sense of the word, the largest mass mobilization since 1965. I found myself in Ferguson, trying to understand those young people who were trying to reimagine, right, politics, right, reimagine African-American politics, challenging this custodial model, because not only does the value gap distort our characters, it distorts our politics. And what we need, right, is a radical revolution of value. And what is the revolution of value? And of course, those of you who've read Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King talks about a revolution of value. I take it up in a different sort of way. If we're going to uproot those habits that sustain the value gap, we need a revolution of value. That revolution of value involves what? Right? That we have to change our demand of government. We have to change our view of government. We change our view of government by changing our demand of government. That requires imagination. We have to change our view of black people. If we're going to change our view of black people, we're going to have to change our view of white people, and that will require imagination. And I say in the book that only white people can kill the idea of white people. And then lastly, I say we have to change what ultimately matters to us. We can't have a society organized on greed, selfishness, and narcissism and claim to have a robust conception of the public good. Some of us preachers, I think, a graduate of this institution, Otis Moss III, we're talking about a moral economy 101, right? To understand what does it mean to say that this is a moral argument and a political argument all at once, right? But if we're going to have a revolution of value, we need a strategy in the streets, a strategy in the courtroom, and sometimes a strategy at the ballot box, right? So we need to reimagine politics, because imagination is the work of seeing what is right in front of us in the glaring light of what could be, as an instantiation of our best selves, right? Something towards which we can reach. You know, in my other work on black perfectionism, you know, there's the image of, on black democratic perfectionism, there's the image in perfectionism of the staircase, right? Reaching for a higher self, leaving a self behind. Well, I'm also mindful of that wonderful African-American notion of life ain't been no crystal stair. A kind of blues-soaked sense of what it means to reach for a higher self in the face of darkness and evil. We need to understand that democracies should be conceived as a moment, as Sheldon Wolin writes, of experience, a crystallized response to deeply felt grievances or needs on the part of those whose main preoccupation is to scratch out a decent existence, right? We might have to return to the small scale, because in my view, small scale is all we have. We might have to think about democracy as standing in opposition, and the importance of that standing to the continuous recreation of political experience, the continued recreation of the conditions for the possibility of a new self. I like to think about this as a kind of politics of tending that I get out of my reading of Sheldon Wolin and my reading of the great Ella Baker. This politics of tending is one that, quote, centers politics around practices, that is, around the habits of competence or skill that are routinely required if things are to be taken care of. Sheldon goes on to say that tending is tempered by the feeling of concern for objects whose nature requires that they be treated as historical and biographical beings. The beings are such as to need regular attention from someone who's concerned about well-being and is sensitive to historical needs. Imagination as an act of empathy. Imagination as an act of empathy is central to the politics of tending, in that it opens us up to the wounds and joys of others. enables habit formation that affirms the dignity of our fellows, and encourages a willingness to embrace those receptive practices, as Ram Coles talks about, those receptive practices of listening and of being still as critical features of a mode of democratic struggle. Tending then gathers politics around rooted, knotted practices, doings and sufferings that evidence habits and dispositions forged over a life lived. To be open to such experiences, to tend to the roughly hewn hands that mark a life of toil, to bloodshot eyes that signal too much drink, to raucous laughter that offer a glimpse of the depths of joy and sadness, and to tend to the blank stare that reveals either defeat or possibility. Tending can be expressed in Miss Ella Baker's powerful question, even when her memories had long faded. Who are your people? The question subverts a sociology, as Ralph Ellison would put it, that reduces the depth of experience to flat statistics of pathology by seeking an account of love and wound that constitute the ground beneath one's feet and the conditions for the possibility of a higher self, the conditions for a genuine democratic politics. We need a new kind of imagination in the face of the darkness we face. And so I end the book with this paragraph. That's all right? Y'all all right? Yeah. I've been talking all around the country, so I don't know when to shut up. But we want to have a conversation, right? In the end, as Amiri Baraka's poem SOS, I use that poem in the book. Come out, come out, come out. Because if we're going to change how we view black people got to change how we view ourselves. We got to start organizing at the margins of our community, right? And this is what Black Lives Matter and these young folk are suggesting to us, right? The crisis engulfing our communities and the nation calls for all of us to come out and to come on in to work on behalf of democracy. An extraordinary challenge lies before us. Failure awaits us too. But no matter, generations before faced their difficulties, we will face ours. With courage and the conviction that American democracy depends upon us, we will disturb the peace of the status quo and dare to imagine a new creation, a different way of being in the world. But first, we must turn our backs. And we do so for a more just and democratic society with a revolution of value, a breakout campaign, we could talk about that, continued grassroots organizing and ongoing direct action in the streets. We can set a new course for this nation. Black people have done it before. In our resistance against slavery, we offered a new path for the country. After the devastation of the Civil War, we put forward a more expansive idea of democracy as we legislated in state houses throughout the reconstructed South. We changed the course of the nation by leaving the rural South and moving into cities in search of freedom. We connected our oppression at home with the effects of empire abroad and challenged directly U.S. foreign policy. This is the heart of democracy in black efforts to imagine a democratic way of life without the burden of the value gap or the illusion that somehow this country is God's gift to the world. We have marched, we have rebelled, we have loved, and we have hated. And in each moment, America has succumbed to the belief that some people are better than others simply because they are white. We see this again today. There are those among us willing to turn their backs on democracy to safeguard their privilege. We won't allow it. We won't allow it. No more sweet talking, no more dancing. No one can be comfortable, and no individual or organization can say they alone represent black people. We are the leaders we've been looking for. Together, we must close the value gap and uproot racial habits by doing democracy once again in black. If we fail this time, and if there is a God, I pray that we don't, this grand experiment in democracy will be no more. Thank you.